The newspaper crumpled in Catherine Porter's hands as she stood outside the Chisholm Ranch schoolhouse in New Mexico, her entire world collapsing around her in the scorching August heat of 1878. The school board's letter had been brief and cutting. Her services were no longer required because she possessed too much education for a frontier town, making the other teachers, and even some of the board members, uncomfortable with her knowledge of literature, mathematics, and philosophy that extended far beyond basic reading and arithmetic. Catherine had come west from Boston 2 years ago after graduating from the female seminary, eager to bring quality education to children who desperately needed it. At 23 years old, she had thrown herself into teaching with a passion that sometimes kept her at the schoolhouse until dark, preparing lessons that went beyond rote memorization. She had introduced her students to Shakespeare, to advanced mathematics, to scientific principles that most frontier schools never touched. The children had flourished under her guidance, but their progress had apparently threatened those who believed education should keep people in their place rather than elevate them. Now she stood in the dusty street with nowhere to go and limited funds to get there. The boarding house where she rented a room had already informed her that without steady employment, she would need to vacate by week's end. Catherine fought back tears as she watched wagons roll past, the familiar landscape of Chisholm Ranch suddenly feeling hostile and unwelcoming. "Miss Porter." A deep voice called from behind her. She turned to find a tall man approaching, his weathered face showing he spent most of his time outdoors. He wore dusty work clothes and a wide-brimmed hat that shaded eyes the color of sun-warmed honey. She recognized him as Maxwell Xavier, the foreman of one of the largest cattle ranches in Lincoln County. He was perhaps 27 or 28, with strong features and a quiet confidence in his stride. "Mr. Xavier," she said, quickly composing herself and smoothing the crumpled letter. "Good afternoon." "I heard what happened," he said, removing his hat respectfully. "The whole town's talking about it. Seems a damned shame, pardon my language, to lose the best teacher these parts have ever seen just because she knows too much." Catherine felt her throat tighten at the unexpected kindness. "Thank you. I'm afraid knowing too much is apparently worse than knowing too little in some people's estimation." Maxwell shifted his weight, turning his hat in his hands. "I have a proposition for you if you would hear me out." "It might sound unusual, but I am serious about it." She waited, curiosity overriding her despair. "I run a ranch about 15 miles northwest of here. We have 23 men working the land, plus their families in some cases. That makes about 40 people total, and I would wager only 5 of them can read more than their own name. Most cannot read at all. I have been thinking for a while now that we need to change that. A man who can read can protect himself from being cheated, can learn new things, can make his own way in the world better." Catherine felt her heart quicken. "You want to hire me to teach your ranch hands, the whole ranch, families included. The children during the day, the adults in the evening if they are willing. I can offer you $75 a month, room and board in the ranch house, and a classroom space in the barn loft that we can fix up proper. It would not be easy work, teaching men who have never held a book in their lives, but I have a feeling if anyone can do it, you can." $75 was more than the school board had paid her. Catherine stared at this man who was offering her not just employment but validation that her education had value. "Why would you do this? Most ranchers would not see the point." Maxwell met her eyes steadily. "My father could not read. He worked himself to death on another man's ranch because he signed a contract he could not read, agreeing to terms that were near slavery. By the time he realized what he had done, he was trapped. I learned to read from a missionary when I was 14, but it was too late to help him. I do not want that for my men. I want them to have choices. The sincerity in his voice moved something deep in Catherine's chest. "When would you want me to start?" "Tomorrow, if you are willing. I have a wagon waiting to take supplies back to the ranch. You could ride with me, see the place, and decide if it suits you." Catherine looked down at the crumpled letter in her hands, then back at Maxwell Xavier's honest face. "I do not need to see it first. I accept your offer." A smile broke across his features, transforming his serious face into something warmer. "I am glad to hear it, Miss Porter. Truly glad." The ride to the ranch took 3 hours over rough terrain, the wagon jostling them as Maxwell guided the horses northwest across land that seemed to stretch forever under the vast New Mexico sky. Catherine held onto the wagon seat and tried not to think about how her life had completely changed direction in a single day. Maxwell proved to be a thoughtful companion, pointing out landmarks and telling her about the ranch's history. "The X-Bar Ranch has been operating for 8 years now," he explained. "The owner, Mr. Thornton, lives in Santa Fe and leaves the running of it to me. We run about 2,000 head of cattle plus horses. It is good land with access to water, which makes all the difference out here." "How did you become foreman?" Catherine asked, genuinely curious. "Started as a ranch hand when I was 16. Mr. Thornton saw that I could read and figure numbers, so he taught me the business side of ranching. When his old foreman retired 5 years ago, he gave me the position. I have been trying to improve things ever since, make it a place where men want to work instead of just needing to work." Catherine found herself studying his profile as he spoke. There was an earnestness about Maxwell Xavier that she found refreshing after the political maneuvering and petty jealousies of the school board. He genuinely cared about the people who worked for him, which was rare in her experience. The ranch appeared on the horizon as the sun began its descent toward the western mountains. The main house was a sprawling adobe structure with a covered porch that wrapped around 3 sides. Beyond it stood a large barn, several corrals filled with horses, and a cluster of smaller buildings that Maxwell explained were bunkhouses and homes for the married hands. Everything was well maintained, speaking to the pride Maxwell took in his work. "The ranch house has 6 bedrooms, Maxwell said as he helped Catherine down from the wagon. "Mr. Thornton stays in one when he visits, which is about twice a year. I use another. The rest are empty, so you can choose whichever suits you best. We have a cook, Rosa, who manages the house and feeds everyone. She's going to be delighted to have another woman around." As if summoned, a round woman with graying black hair emerged from the house, wiping her hands on her apron. Her face lit up when she saw Catherine. "Senor Maxwell, you brought the teacher. Welcome, welcome. I am Rosa Martinez. Come inside, you must be exhausted from the journey." Rosa's warmth was immediate and genuine as she ushered Catherine into the cool interior of the house. The main room was spacious and comfortable, furnished simply but well. Rosa showed Catherine to a bedroom on the 2nd floor with windows that looked out over the ranch and the mountains beyond. It was easily twice the size of her boarding house room, with a real bed frame, a dresser, a washstand, and even a small desk. "This is wonderful," Catherine said, setting down her traveling bag. "Thank you, Mrs. Martinez. Just Rosa, please. I will bring water for washing, and dinner will be ready in 1 hour. Senor Maxwell, he is a good man. You will see." After Rosa left, Catherine sank onto the bed and let out a long breath. This morning she had been fired and facing an uncertain future. Now she was in a comfortable room on a ranch where her education was valued rather than feared. It seemed almost too good to be true. That evening, Maxwell gathered the ranch hands who lived in the bunkhouse to introduce Catherine. The men filed into the main house's large dining room, hats in hands, looking curious and somewhat skeptical. They ranged in age from late teens to grizzled men in their 50s, their faces weathered by sun and wind. Catherine stood beside Maxwell, acutely aware of being examined by 24 pairs of eyes. "Men, this is Miss Catherine Porter," Maxwell began. "She was teaching at the Chisholm Ranch School until yesterday, when they let her go for being too educated. Their loss is our gain. Starting tomorrow, she will be teaching reading, writing, and arithmetic to anyone on this ranch who wants to learn. Classes for children will be during the day. For adults, we will hold evening sessions after supper. Attendance is not required, but I am strongly encouraging everyone to participate." A lean man with a scarred face spoke up. "No offense to the lady, but I am 34 years old. Seems a bit late to be learning letters." "It is never too late," Catherine said, her voice steady and clear. "I've taught students from age 5 to 50. The human brain is capable of learning at any age. Some of you may feel embarrassed about not knowing how to read, but there is no shame in it. The shame lies in remaining ignorant when the opportunity to learn is offered." Another man, younger with red hair, raised his hand tentatively. "What would we learn exactly? Just reading our names. Reading opens entire worlds," Catherine replied, warming to her subject. "You would learn to read newspapers so you know what is happening beyond this ranch. You would learn to read contracts and legal documents so no one can cheat you. You would learn to write letters to family members far away. You would learn mathematics that can help you manage money, measure land, calculate fair wages. And if you want to go further, I can teach history, literature, science, whatever interests you." She saw interest flickering in some faces, doubt in others. Maxwell added, "I will be attending classes myself. I can read, but Miss Porter knows things I do not, and I aim to learn them. Any man here can be better than he was yesterday. That is what this is about." The meeting broke up with mixed reactions, but Catherine noticed several men lingering to ask quiet questions before they left. A young cowboy, barely 20, approached her shyly. "Miss Porter, I am James. I would like to learn. My girl back in Texas, she writes me letters, but I have to ask others to read them to me. It is not right, having my private words read by strangers." Catherine smiled at him. "Then you will learn, James. Within a few months, you will be reading her letters yourself and writing back in your own hand." The hope that bloomed on his face reminded her why she loved teaching. Over the next week, Catherine transformed the barn loft into a schoolroom. Maxwell assigned 2 of the ranch hands to help her carry up benches, set up a large slate board, and arrange the space for both children and adults. She used some of her salary to order books, slates, chalk, and writing supplies from Santa Fe, though it would take weeks for them to arrive. In the meantime, she made do with what she had brought and materials she created herself. The children were her first students. 7 youngsters ranging from 6 to 13 showed up that first Monday morning, shepherded by their mothers who looked at Catherine with a mixture of hope and wariness. These were the children of married ranch hands who lived in the small houses scattered around the main buildings. Catherine quickly assessed their abilities and found that only 2 could read simple words. The rest knew nothing. She started with the basics, but made them engaging, telling stories as she taught letters, using the children's own names and the world around them as teaching tools. By the end of the first week, even the youngest could recognize several letters and understood that those letters formed words with meaning. The children's enthusiasm was infectious, and Catherine found herself energized rather than exhausted by the long teaching days. The evening classes were a different challenge. 12 men showed up the first night, most looking uncomfortable sitting on benches clearly meant for children. Catherine began with the alphabet, but she could see some were ready to walk out from sheer embarrassment at their ignorance. "Gentlemen," she said, "learning to read is no different than learning to rope a steer or break a horse. It requires practice, patience, and perseverance. You all have those qualities, or you would not survive as ranch hands. Bring those same qualities to this and you will succeed." Maxwell sat in the front row, hunched over his slate like the others. His presence, this man who commanded the entire ranch submitting himself to Catherine's teaching, made the others more willing to try. She noticed how he encouraged the men who struggled, how he praised small victories, how his respect for the learning process rubbed off on the others. As the weeks passed, Catherine fell into a rhythm she loved. Long days teaching children, shorter but intense evening sessions with the adults, and the satisfaction of watching both groups' progress. She also found herself increasingly aware of Maxwell Xavier. He was a constant presence without being intrusive. He attended every evening class without fail, and his genuine interest in learning inspired the others. But beyond that, Catherine found herself noticing the way he dealt with problems on the ranch with calm fairness, how he remembered small details about each person's life, how his rare smiles transformed his serious face. He often stopped by the schoolroom during the day to see how things were going, and their conversations grew longer, ranging from teaching methods to books to their different experiences of life. One evening in late September, after the other students had filed out, Maxwell lingered. "You have made remarkable progress with the men. Even old Henry, who swore he was too old to learn, can now write his own name and read simple sentences." Catherine was erasing the slate board, and she turned to smile at him. "Henry is one of my best students. He practices constantly. I see him in the evenings with his slate, working through the exercises. You have a gift for this," Maxwell said. "The way you make people believe they can do it, that is rare. I simply show them the truth. They have the capability, they always did. They just needed the opportunity and someone to believe in them." Maxwell stepped closer, his expression serious. "Like someone gave you the opportunity to teach here when the world told you that you knew too much. I am grateful every day that I heard about your situation, Catherine. You have changed this ranch already." It was the first time he had used her given name, and the sound of it in his deep voice sent warmth through her. "You gave me the opportunity when no one else would, Maxwell. I am the one who is grateful." They stood there in the lamplit barn loft, the evening air cooling around them, something unspoken building between them. Finally, Maxwell cleared his throat. "I should let you rest. Tomorrow is another teaching day." But he did not move immediately, and neither did Catherine. The moment stretched, full of possibility, before Maxwell finally turned and descended the loft ladder, leaving Catherine with a racing heart, and the realization that her feelings for her employer had grown far beyond gratitude and respect. October brought cooler weather and a crisis that tested everything Catherine had built. A traveling salesman came through, offering to sell ranch supplies at supposedly discounted prices. He presented contracts to several of the ranch hands, claiming the deals were extraordinary but only available if they signed immediately. 3 men, none of whom had attended Catherine's classes, signed before Maxwell found out. When Maxwell reviewed the contracts, his face went white with fury. "These are loans at 25% interest, disguised as supply purchases. The supplies are overpriced by half their value. These men just signed away their wages for the next year." He called an emergency meeting, and Catherine watched as he explained to the 3 men what they had done. The devastation on their faces cut through her. One of them, a man named Pedro with a wife and 2 children, looked physically ill. "I just wanted to provide better for my family," Pedro said, his voice breaking. "He said it was a good deal. I did not know." "It is not your fault," Maxwell said firmly. "The fault lies with a man who takes advantage of people. But this is why learning to read is not optional anymore. This is why it matters." He turned to Catherine. "Can you teach these men to read well enough to understand contracts, quickly?" Yes, she said without hesitation, if they are willing to work hard. The three men became her most dedicated students. Every spare moment they had, they were in the loft with Catherine, learning not just to read, but to understand the language of legal documents, to spot deceptive wording, to ask questions. Maxwell worked with a lawyer in Santa Fe to find a way to break the fraudulent contracts, but it was a slow process. During those intense weeks, Catherine and Maxwell spent many late nights planning lessons and strategies. They worked side by side at the dining table, surrounded by papers and books, often talking until Rosa came to scold them for staying up too late. Catherine learned about Maxwell's childhood, about his father's death, about his determination to build something better. Maxwell learned about Catherine's education in Boston, her love of learning, her frustration with a world that limited women's opportunities. One night in early November, after they had finally found a legal loophole to invalidate the predatory contracts, Maxwell leaned back in his chair and ran a hand through his dark hair. "We did it. Pedro and the others are free. You did it," Catherine said. "You fought for them when many employers would have just let them suffer the consequences. I could not have done it without you. You taught them to understand what was done to them. You gave them tools to protect themselves in the future." He looked at her across the table, his eyes intense in the lamplight. "Catherine, I need to tell you something. These past months working with you, watching you change lives, I have come to care for you. More than I should perhaps as your employer, but I cannot help it. You are the most remarkable woman I have ever met, and I find myself thinking about you constantly." Catherine's breath caught. She had felt the connection between them growing, but hearing him voice it made her heart soar. "Maxwell, I care for you too. I have been trying to remain professional, but my feelings will not be denied." He stood and came around the table, gently pulling her to her feet. "I do not want you to deny them. I want to court you properly if you will allow it. I know there are complications with our working relationship, but I believe we can navigate them." "Yes," Catherine said, looking up into his face. "Yes, I want that." Maxwell cupped her face in his hands, his touch gentle despite his rough-skinned palms. "You are extraordinary, Catherine Porter. You deserve everything good in this world." When he kissed her, it was soft and questioning, full of restrained passion and deep respect. Catherine melted into it, her hands resting on his chest, feeling his heartbeat racing as fast as her own. When they finally pulled apart, both were breathing hard, and Maxwell rested his forehead against hers. "I have wanted to do that for weeks," he admitted. "I have wanted you to," Catherine replied, earning her another kiss, deeper this time. Their courtship unfolded over the following months with a sweetness that surprised them both. Maxwell was attentive and thoughtful, bringing Catherine wildflowers from the range, ensuring she had everything she needed for teaching, carving time out of his demanding schedule to take walks with her in the evenings. Catherine found herself falling deeply in love with this man who valued education, treated his workers with fairness, and looked at her as though she were the most precious thing in his world. The ranch hands noticed and approved. Rosa became their staunchest supporter, leaving them alone together more often and humming happily while she cooked. Even Mr. Thornton, when he arrived for his winter visit, gave his blessing after watching Maxwell and Catherine together for all of 2 hours. "You have done well, Maxwell," Thornton said. "The ranch prospers, and now you have found a woman worthy of you. When you marry her, and I assume you will, I will transfer ownership of half the ranch to you as a wedding gift. You have earned it 10 times over." Christmas of 1878 brought unexpected snow, and a celebration unlike any Catherine had experienced. The entire ranch gathered in the main house, which Rosa had decorated with pine branches and candles. Catherine's students, both children and adults, presented her with gifts they had made. A carved wooden box from Henry, hand-stitched bookmarks from the children, a tooled leather book cover from Pedro. But the most precious gift was watching James read aloud a letter he had written to his sweetheart, his face glowing with pride at his accomplishment. Maxwell gave Catherine a beautiful leather-bound journal with her initials embossed on the cover. "For recording your thoughts, your teaching experiences, your life," he said. "Everything you write is valuable, Catherine. Your words deserve to be preserved." She gave him a book of poetry she had ordered from Boston, inscribed with words of love she had been too shy to speak aloud. He read them there in front of the fire while people laughed and celebrated around them, then pulled her close and whispered, "I love you too, more than I have words to express." On New Year's Eve, under a sky brilliant with stars, Maxwell proposed. They stood on the porch of the ranch house, wrapped in blankets against the cold, watching the last day of the year fade into night. He produced a simple gold ring and took her hand. "Catherine Porter, you came into my life when I was not looking for anyone, and you changed everything. You brought learning and hope to this ranch, but more than that, you brought light to my life. I want to spend every day of my future with you, learning from you, loving you, building a life together. Will you marry me?" Catherine felt tears freezing on her cheeks as she nodded. "Yes, Maxwell Xavier. Yes, with all my heart." The ring slid onto her finger perfectly, and Maxwell kissed her as the men in the bunkhouse began whooping and firing guns into the air to welcome 1879. Rosa appeared with champagne that she had been saving for this exact moment, and the celebration lasted well into the new year. They married in March of 1879, in a simple ceremony at the ranch, surrounded by everyone who lived and worked there. Catherine wore a dress of ivory silk that Rosa and the ranch wives had helped her sew, and Maxwell wore a new suit that made him look both uncomfortable and devastatingly handsome. The local minister performed the ceremony in the main room of the house, which had been decorated with early spring flowers. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Maxwell kissed Catherine with such tenderness that several of the women dabbed at their eyes. The celebration that followed was joyous and heartfelt, with fiddle music and dancing and food that Rosa had been preparing for days. As Catherine danced with her husband, she marveled at how drastically her life had changed in less than a year. "Happy, Mrs. Xavier?" Maxwell murmured against her hair. "Happier than I ever imagined possible," she replied honestly. Their wedding night was spent in the master bedroom, which Maxwell had renovated and redecorated as a surprise. He carried her over the threshold, both of them laughing, and then grew serious as he set her down. "I want you to know that I see you as my equal in everything, Catherine. This ranch, this life, it is ours together now. Your teaching is just as important as the cattle business, and your dreams matter as much as mine." Catherine pulled him down for a kiss that communicated everything she felt: love, desire, gratitude, hope for their future. Their coming together was tender and passionate, a physical expression of the deep emotional bond they had formed. Afterward, lying in Maxwell's arms, Catherine thought about the cruel irony that being fired for knowing too much had led her to the greatest happiness of her life. The years that followed were rich and fulfilling. Catherine continued teaching, expanding the program until nearly everyone on the ranch could read and write at a basic level. Several of the younger students went on to advanced studies, including James, who eventually became a teacher himself. The X-Bar Ranch became known throughout New Mexico, not just for its cattle but for its educated workforce, and other ranches began asking Catherine to help them establish similar programs. Maxwell continued as foreman and co-owner, managing the ranch with wisdom and fairness. He and Catherine made decisions together, their partnership strengthening with each passing year. They faced challenges: droughts, harsh winters, market fluctuations. the occasional cattle thief, but they faced them together, and that made all the difference. In the spring of 1880, Catherine discovered she was pregnant. Maxwell was overjoyed, already making plans to expand the house and talking about teaching their child to read practically from birth. Catherine laughed at his enthusiasm but shared his excitement. Rosa immediately took it upon herself to prepare for the baby's arrival, knitting blankets and sewing tiny clothes. Their son was born in December of 1880, during a cold snap that froze the water troughs but left the sky brilliantly clear. They named him Thomas William Xavier, and he arrived with healthy lungs and a head of dark hair like his father's. Maxwell held his son with shaking hands, tears streaming down his face, and Catherine felt her heart expand with a love so fierce it frightened her. "He will grow up knowing how to read and write," Maxwell said softly. "He will have every opportunity we can give him. He will be educated and free." Thomas was followed by a daughter, Margaret Ann, in 1882, and another son, Henry James, in 1884. The house filled with noise and laughter and the constant activity of children. Catherine balanced teaching with motherhood, sometimes bringing the children to the schoolroom where they learned alongside the ranch children. Maxwell was a devoted father, teaching his children to ride almost as soon as they could walk, reading to them every night, showing them that education and practical skills both had value. By 1885, the X-Bar Ranch had become something more than just a cattle operation. It was a community where literacy was the norm, where children received education that rivaled city schools, where adults had the tools to protect themselves and pursue their dreams. Several of Catherine's students had gone on to open businesses, become teachers themselves, or take positions that required literacy skills. The ranch hands who remained were among the best educated cowboys in the territory. Mr. Thornton, on one of his visits, walked through the ranch with Catherine and Maxwell, observing the changes. "You two have built something remarkable here," he said. "This is not just a ranch anymore. It is a model for how things should be done. Education and opportunity creating prosperity for everyone, not just the owner." Catherine smiled, watching Thomas help a younger child sound out words while Margaret organized the slates and Henry chased a dog through the yard. It started because someone valued education enough to hire a teacher who was fired for knowing too much. Maxwell saw possibility where others saw threat. "And you saw potential in people that others overlooked," Maxwell added, slipping his arm around her waist. "We make a good team." They did make a good team, Catherine reflected as they continued their walk. What had begun as a practical solution to her unemployment had become a love story that continued to deepen with each passing year. Maxwell still looked at her with the same warmth and admiration he had shown when they first met, and Catherine loved him more each day for his integrity, his kindness, and his unwavering support of her work. The evening classes continued, now sometimes taught by Catherine's former students who had mastered reading and wanted to give back. The schoolroom in the barn loft had been expanded twice, and talk was growing of building a proper schoolhouse that could serve the ranch and surrounding area. Catherine had written to the Boston Female Seminary, encouraging them to send more teachers west with the promise that there were places that valued educated women rather than feared them. On a warm evening in May of 1886, Catherine and Maxwell sat on their porch watching the sunset paint the mountains gold and purple. Their children were finally asleep after a day of energetic play, and the ranch was settling into peaceful quiet. Maxwell held Catherine's hand, his thumb tracing circles on her palm. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked. "Coming here, leaving behind what could have been a more conventional life." Catherine turned to look at him, this man who had given her so much. "Regret? Maxwell, you gave me my life. That school board fired me because they were afraid of what I knew, afraid of what I might teach others. You hired me because you understood that knowledge is power and everyone deserves access to it. You saw me, truly saw me, when most of the world wanted me to be less than I was. How could I possibly regret that? You could have married a scholar, someone from your own background. Instead, you got a cowboy foreman who still struggles with some of the philosophy you love. I got a man who believes in justice, who treats people with dignity, who changed the lives of dozens of people by giving them the gift of literacy. I got a partner who respects my mind and my work. I got someone who loves me completely. She leaned her head on his shoulder. And for what it is worth, you understand philosophy better than you think. You simply live it rather than just discussing it. Maxwell kissed the top of her head. I love you, Catherine Xavier. Thank you for saying yes that day in Chisholm Ranch when I offered you this wild idea. Thank you for offering it. Thank you for seeing that education was not something to fear but something to embrace. As the stars began to emerge in the darkening sky, Catherine thought about the journey that had brought her here. She had been fired for being too educated, cast out by people who saw knowledge as dangerous rather than liberating. But that rejection had led her to Maxwell, to this ranch, to a life where her education was valued and used to change lives. She had found love in the most unexpected place, with a man who had understood that teaching people to read was about giving them freedom. The children she taught, both past and present, would go into the world with tools to protect themselves, to pursue their dreams, to make their own choices. The adults she taught had gained dignity and agency, able to navigate a world that had previously been full of traps for the illiterate. And she had found a love that fulfilled her completely, a partnership built on mutual respect and shared values. Years continued to pass, each one building on the successes of the last. By 1890, the X-Bar Ranch School served not just the ranch but children from surrounding areas, with 3 teachers working under Catherine's direction. The literacy rate in their corner of New Mexico was among the highest in the territory. Several of Catherine's first students had gone on to college back east, returning with degrees and ambitions to improve their communities. Thomas, now 9 years old, was already reading at an advanced level and showed his mother's love of learning. Margaret, at 8, had a mathematical mind that startled even Catherine with its quickness. Henry, at 6, was more like his father, practical and hands-on, but he loved stories and would listen for hours to anyone reading aloud. The children grew up surrounded by books and learning, but also by the practical realities of ranch life, giving them a balanced education that prepared them for anything. Maxwell had become one of the most respected ranchers in New Mexico, not just for his successful operation, but for his innovative approach to labor and education. He wrote articles for agricultural journals about the benefits of an educated workforce, arguing that ranchers who invested in their workers' literacy saw better productivity, fewer disputes, and greater loyalty. Some mocked his ideas, but others began tentatively implementing their own educational programs. Catherine had published a book about her teaching methods, specifically focused on adult literacy, which had been well received in educational circles. She received letters from teachers across the West, and even some from the East Coast, asking for advice on establishing similar programs. The woman who had been fired for being too educated had become a recognized authority on frontier education. One evening in the autumn of 1892, the ranch hosted a celebration for the 10th anniversary of Catherine and Maxwell's wedding. The entire community gathered, including former students who had traveled from as far as Denver and San Francisco to attend. As Catherine looked around at the crowd of people whose lives had been touched by the simple act of learning to read, she felt overwhelmed with gratitude. James, her first adult student, stood to make a toast. He was now 28, married to the sweetheart whose letters had motivated him to learn, and working as a teacher in Texas. Miss Catherine, or I should say Mrs. Xavier, changed my life when she taught me to read. But more than that, she showed me that it is never too late to learn, never too late to grow. She saw potential in a bunch of cowboys who thought they were too old or too dumb for book learning, and she was right. We were wrong about ourselves. I have built my entire career on the foundation she gave me, and I know I am not the only one. To Catherine and Maxwell Xavier, who built something beautiful out here in the wilderness. The crowd raised their glasses, and Catherine felt Maxwell squeeze her hand. Later, when they had a moment alone, he pulled her into the shadows beyond the lantern light. 14 years ago, I took a chance on hiring a fired schoolteacher to teach cowboys to read. Best decision I ever made. 14 years ago, I took a chance on a cowboy foreman with an unusual proposition. Best decision I ever made. They kissed, surrounded by the sounds of celebration, two people who had found each other against the odds and built a life that exceeded both their dreams. The years ahead would bring more challenges and more triumphs, watching their children grow and their community flourish. But in that moment, they had everything they needed: each other, their family, and the knowledge that education had truly set people free. The ranch continued to prosper and grow. By the turn of the century, the X-Bar Ranch School had become a model that other communities studied and replicated. Catherine had trained dozens of teachers, spreading her methods across the West. Maxwell had expanded the ranch and become a voice for progressive labor practices in the cattle industry. Their children had grown into thoughtful, educated adults who carried forward their parents' values. Thomas became a lawyer, dedicating himself to protecting workers' rights and fighting exploitative contracts like the ones that had once trapped ranch hands. Margaret became a teacher and eventually a professor of mathematics, breaking barriers for women in academia. Henry took over management of the X-Bar Ranch, continuing his father's legacy of fair treatment and educational opportunity for all workers. Catherine and Maxwell grew old together, their love deepening with each passing year. They sat on their porch on countless evenings, watching sunsets and talking about everything and nothing. When Catherine's hair turned silver and Maxwell's face became even more weathered, they still held hands like young lovers, still found joy in each other's company, still marveled at what they had built together. On their 40th wedding anniversary in 1919, surrounded by children, grandchildren, former students and friends, Catherine reflected on the strange path her life had taken. Being fired for being too educated had seemed like the end of her world, but it had actually been the beginning of everything good. It had brought her to Maxwell, to this ranch, to a life of purpose and love that she could never have imagined in that dusty street in Chisholm Ranch all those years ago. "What are you thinking about?" Maxwell asked, his voice still warm despite the years. "About how sometimes the worst things that happen to us lead to the best things in our lives. About how one man's willingness to value education over ignorance changed not just his ranch but an entire community. About how much I love you, Maxwell Xavier." He smiled, that same smile that still made her heart flutter. "I was just thinking about how a fired schoolteacher took a chance on a cowboy's crazy idea and ended up teaching whole generations to read, and about how much I love you, Catherine Xavier." They kissed, these two people who had found each other decades ago and built a legacy of education, opportunity, and love. Around them, their family and community celebrated, living proof that knowledge was indeed power, that education could transform lives, and that sometimes the greatest love stories began with the most unexpected propositions. The X-Bar Ranch would continue for generations, always maintaining its commitment to education and fair treatment of workers. The school Catherine founded would eventually become a public institution serving the entire county. Her teaching methods would be studied in universities. Maxwell's labor practices would influence ranching across the West. But more than any of that, they had created a family bound by love and a community bound by opportunity. As the sun set on their 40th anniversary, painting the New Mexico sky in brilliant colors, Catherine and Maxwell held each other close. They had lived a full life, rich with meaning and accomplishment. They had faced challenges and overcome them together. They had raised children who would make the world better. They had loved each other through 4 decades of joy and sorrow, triumph and struggle. And it had all started because a cowboy had the wisdom to see that an educated woman was an asset, not a threat. And a woman had the courage to accept an unconventional opportunity. Their love story had unfolded against the backdrop of the Wild West, full of drama and passion, heartfelt and true. It was a testament to the power of seeing potential where others saw only problems, of valuing knowledge over ignorance, of choosing love over fear. They had built something beautiful together, something that would outlast them both. And as they sat together watching the stars emerge, they knew that every moment had been worth it. Every challenge overcome had strengthened them. Every choice they made together had led them to exactly where they belonged. In each other's arms, surrounded by the legacy they had created, secure in a love that would endure beyond their lifetimes. The teacher who was fired for being too educated had found her greatest success. The cowboy who hired her to teach his entire ranch to read had found his greatest love. Together, they had proven that education and opportunity could transform not just individuals but entire communities, and that sometimes the most powerful force in the world was simply 2 people who believed in each other and in the transformative power of knowledge. Their story, born in the Wild West of 1878, had become a legend that would inspire generations to come. A reminder that being true to one's values and taking chances on unconventional ideas could lead to extraordinary outcomes.